Google is really the great Goliath in this whole story. Google is, in the words of Julian Assange in an article that he wrote, this is the verbatim title, "Google is not what it seems." Google, I always joke that it's not a joke, but I always sort of say a little bit tongue in cheek that none of the tech companies wanted to go through with the internet censorship protocols that were forced on them by the government between 2017 and 2020, and which continues today. Jack Dorsey didn't want to deplatform President Trump. He came out later and said it was a business decision. They were forced to do it. Mark Zuckerberg said in 2019 in a speech in San Jose that the pendulum of censorship had swung too far, and that he wanted to swing it back towards freedom of speech, and then ended up censoring more than ever because of the sort of government-induced coercion that continued on him. The one exception to this is Google. Google did not have to be prodded too hard to do this. They, I think, did it gleefully. And part of that is because Google really is an extension of the foreign policy establishment itself. There's a much clearer line between Twitter and the U.S. government, and even between Facebook and the U.S. government, than there is between Google. Google itself started, as a CIA NSA project in a certain respect. I mean, now I don't think that Larry Page and Sergey Brin would agree with that characterization. It's a bit glib, but the fact is Google started in 1996, and it started because of the work that was done in 1995 out of a DARPA grant that the two founders had at Stanford when they were PhD students working on, the backbone architecture of Google, which was again funded by DARPA, the Pentagon, and specifically a joint CIA NSA program called the Massive Digital Data Services Program at DARPA, which was this joint CIA NSA data collection sweep to try to see how, quote, birds of a feather were flocking together in the newly privatized internet. So, in 1991, the World Wide Web came out, and Web 1.0 was forums and blogs and static.com websites. And these were immediately piped into dissident groups around the world that were being funded by the CIA and were being liaised with the State Department and were being instrumentalized by the Pentagon in order to help those dissident groups develop their own independent media and communication channels in countries where there was state control over media. So it allowed them to basically popularize their ideas and create a critical mass to overthrow a government that the CIA and the Pentagon, the State Department wanted deposed, so to speak. So in order to track the spread of that information, to see how political groups are using this newly open internet, there was this birds of a feather flocking together program that Larry Page and Sergey Brin were a part of in 1995 at Stanford. And Stanford is now continues to be the number one place where they were the number one place for digital freedom in the 1990s and 2000s. And they were one of the four universities that, when DARPA turned over the internet to the National Science Foundation before the World Wide Web, Stanford was one of the four central university nodes in that web. Today it's actually the Stanford Internet Observatory, which is this kind of CIA hotbed within Stanford that was largely responsible for so much of COVID censorship. They started something called the Virality Project, which chopped up 4 different categories of COVID dissent. And then we talked about COVID origins. And we talked about COVID mandates or lockdowns or masks, or even conspiracy theories about individuals like Peter Daszak or Tony Fauci were all being tracked by this, essentially CIA State Department cell within Stanford that captured hundreds of millions of social media content using their, sort of AI powered, toolkit that we might get to. These are the weapons of mass deletions I talk about. But essentially, Google started out that way. They started out, being powered by the CIA, the NSA, and the Pentagon. The only reason that they had the amazing tools that they did, like Google Maps wasn't this, amazing project that Google came up with. They bought the keyhole satellite technology for Google Maps directly from the Central Intelligence Agency. That was a CIA satellite software that they purchased. The CIA hadn't come up with that. Google wouldn't have it. And Google became a military contractor in 2004, the first year they went private. They were always an arm of the national security state. They always had their monopoly because they were protected by the U.S. government. There was never daylight between government and Google.